First of all, my name is Father Kahle Ellis, and I am the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences here at Villanova University. And it is a great honor to welcome all of you to our campus on behalf of the college. And particularly to have so many Lincoln scholars present here and guests. I would certainly like to congratulate the organizers of this conference, and particularly Dr. Kahle and Sheehan. The day before President Obama's inauguration, an op-ed piece appeared in the New York Times entitled "A Pragmatic Precedent." And it was co-authored, I'm sure many of you saw it, it was co-authored by Henry Louis Gates and John Stauffer. And the article asked, what would Lincoln think of Barack Obama, since so much has been written about what Barack Obama thinks about Lincoln? And from the program, it appears that many of the questions that were addressed in this article will be addressed here as well. But the pragmatic precedent of the title intrigued me the most. And I think perhaps it's because those of us who are engaged in administration, have to exercise this particular virtue more than we would like to. But I think that this particular topic, or this particular title for this article, maybe tells us about what it is necessary to achieve greatness and to touch what the title of this conference is about, the better angels of our nature. So I would like to quote the passage. Lincoln's great achievement in the eyes of posterity was really the outcome of his ingrained pragmatism. The Emancipation Proclamation was born of a certain opportunism. To win the war, Lincoln said, he needed freed slaves to defeat their former masters, and is not a lesser thing for it. And perhaps there is a lesson for Mr. Obama here. Those who invoke high ideas and scorn compromise often bring themselves into disrepute. Those whose actions are conditioned by an exquisite sense of frailty, by an understanding that it's more important to avoid the worst than to attain the best, may better serve those ideals in the end. And so it is with an exquisite appreciation of our common frailty and the sometimes difficult understanding that it is sometimes more important to avoid the worst than to attain the best, that I welcome you this morning, and I wish you the most productive conference. Thank you very much.
I have the privilege of chairing this session, and I do underscore it as a privilege, first of all, to be a participant in this conference, second of all, to be working with Kahle and Sheehan, and third of all, to have on the panel, for which I'm responsible, such very interesting and distinguished people. I would like to exercise what small droit de seigneur I have as the chair of this session to lay down a couple of ground rules. One being that I'm going to introduce everybody en masse at the beginning, and then allow each person who is a part of this panel to advance to the microphone and then speak. Also, I shall be probably an enforcer of some intimidating demeanor in terms of time, and so that if I find someone like Lucas Morel maundering on to no particular point and to the great exhaustion of the hour and the audience, I will reach out and grab him by the scruff of the neck and compel him to sit down. I did not bring my hook with me for this occasion, as I really did not think it would be appropriate as an instrument of violence. However, I can supply myself personally whatever violence may be required to make people stop talking. That, with a conference of academics, is also always a professional hazard. The subject of this particular session, within the overall context of the better angels of our nature, a quote, incidentally, which we associate almost automatically with Abraham Lincoln, but which we should be aware that Lincoln lifted without attribution from his favorite homeboy, William Shakespeare. quotations from Shakespeare are embedded throughout Lincoln's writings. I say that he did it without attribution, not by way of accusing Lincoln of any kind of plagiarism, but because Lincoln, of course, was not obligated to provide footnotes and textual apparatus in every utterance that he made. But it's interesting that the better angels of our nature does refer back over a long period of time to Lincoln's interests. And it was not merely an inspiration of the moment, not merely a well-turned phrase invented for the occasion of the first inaugural. The subject of this particular session is Lincoln's priority, union or liberty for all. How we love binary oppositions in academe, how we love to pit A against B and then C against D. We love to see the world in these either-ors because it's so much more easy than dealing with the actual complexities of human life, which only very rarely sort themselves out conveniently into categories of A and B or C and D. The question, union and liberty, of course, is not unique to this conference. It was posed at the very beginnings of the American Republic by the Anti-Federalists, for whom liberty was the prime jewel and union the threat. It also became a question that was the center of the Webster-Hayne debates, which in turn were linked to the issue of South Carolina's claim to have authority to nullify federal tariff legislation. And perhaps the most famous of all utterances connected with union and liberty is that of Daniel Webster, speaking in response to Hayne over the South Carolina nullification crisis, insisting that union and liberty were one and inseparable, that union should not be construed as a threat to the liberty of individuals or even of states, and that liberty needed to be enjoyed within the context of union. Liberty was not merely a synonym for anarchy or for self-will. That was the question then. Of course, this continued to be the question for 30 years after Webster and Hayne, and it becomes the question deposited on the doorstep of Abraham Lincoln as he is inaugurated President of the United States. And he too must respond to the stark binary division posed by secession. Shall it be union or shall it be liberty? If one cannot have one, is it quite permitted to seize with violence the other? For the southern states, the question was entirely a matter of liberty. Union was a threat to liberty. Therefore, down with union. For Lincoln, the question pointed in another direction. Not, can one have union and then crush liberty? Lincoln's task was to unite union and liberty, to insist that liberty could not live, could not enjoy its full expanse without union, and union, lacking liberty, would be meaningless. Maybe the heart of the American experiment, as Lincoln himself called it, was exactly this question: how to unite liberty, meaningful liberty, real liberty, not the liberty of the imagination, not the triumph of the will, but real liberty with real union that is strong enough to defend itself. He posed the question in these terms: can the desire for liberty be so great that in fact it weakens the very polity in which liberty is supposed to exist, so that liberty becomes prey to the first strong wolf which happens along to devour it? Or is it a case that union is so important and so needed for protection and defense that union itself quashes liberty? These were the questions confronting Lincoln. He wanted to avoid the binary answers. Curiously, these are not questions which have left us today. Today we are again posed with the dilemma: union, or shall we say security and defense, or liberty? And again, the promoters of the binary method are the ones who confront us today. Once again, we are called to an appreciation of complexity. Who better as a model to guide us in these times of complexity and binary demands than Abraham Lincoln, who, after all, has been there and done that. It's our pleasure to have as part of this panel Professor Lucas Morell of Washington and Lee University. Lucas holds a PhD in political science from the Claremont Graduate School. I often joke with Lucas. As a historian, I really do not understand political science people. I do not speak political science. When I hear political scientists come together, it is a mystery to me what on earth it is they're talking about. It is only among political scientists, and then again I have to recognize there are such things as political scientists, political philosophers, political theorists. I don't know, they all look the same to me. I am just a poor benighted history person. Whenever I find myself in the midst of political scientists like Lucas, I feel for the first time in my life like a raving empiricist. Nevertheless, always it is a refreshing moment to be with Lucas Morell, and he will be speaking to us first in our session. Chandra Manning comes to us by way of Harvard University, where she earned her PhD, working under the late and lamented William Gannap, a great Lincolnite in his own right. She teaches at Georgetown University and is the author of What This Cruel War Was Over, a wonderful play of words on a famous song coming out of the Civil War, When This Cruel War Is Over. But her title points us instead to what we must look at as the causes of the Civil War. Finally, as the commentator and discussant, Derek Webb, who enjoys a PhD from Notre Dame under the great Michael Zucker, and who is now a Madison Fellow at Princeton, will be providing commentary and opening questions for our presenters today at the conclusion of his remarks. So without further ado or long-windedness from myself, I present to you Professor Lucas Morell, to be followed by Professor Chandra Manning, and then to be discussed by Derek Webb.
Thank you, Alan. Speaking of binaries, President Obama spoke at a dinner last night in Springfield, Illinois, and he spoke over and over again about union, and I don't think he mentioned the word liberty once. So let's see if that has anything to do with how he plans to stimulate us. We were asked to consider if Lincoln's priority was preserving the American Union or promoting liberty for all. Lincoln took up the question of liberty when he addressed a sanitary fair in Baltimore, Maryland in April of 1864. And this is what he said. He said, "The world has never had a good definition of liberty, and the American people just now are much in want of one. We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing. With some, the word liberty may mean for each man to do as he pleases with himself, and the product of his labor. While with others, the same word may mean for some men to do as they please with other men, and the product of other men's labor. Here are two, not only different, but incompatible things, called by the same name, liberty. And it follows that each of the things is by the respective parties called by two different and incompatible names, liberty and tyranny." So what does it mean to be for liberty? For Southerners who rejected Lincoln as president and attempted to form a government separate from the American Union, liberty meant the right of the slaveholder to deprive a black man of his freedom simply on the basis of his race. Lincoln reminded Americans that this policy of whites doing just what they pleased with blacks, being responsible to God alone, bore a strong resemblance to the old argument for the divine right of kings. Freedom for me at the expense of thee does not sound like the proper application of the Declaration of Independence to Lincoln. But this was how the slaveholders translated the fundamental charter of American liberty. This definition could only be found, according to Lincoln, in the Wolf's Dictionary. And needless to say, Lincoln rejected that definition. But he would also reject at least the practical definition offered by many abolitionists. Folks like William Lloyd Garrison, publisher of the premier abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, and yes, I am speaking over that noise outside. Garrison defined liberty as the equal possession of all human beings, regardless of race. So far, Lincoln would agree. However, Lincoln found their definition untenable as a practical matter because Garrison and his ilk dismissed the federal Constitution because it represented a union with slaveholders, and therefore an unconscionable compromise with God's endowing all men with rights, the same rights, so long as the national government could be enlisted to protect slavery through, for example, the notorious 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. It was not a government morally binding on any decent American citizen. Garrisons Rhetoric, as you can imagine, also created difficulties for civic discussion and resolution regarding the future of slavery in the United States. In 1832, Garrison called the U.S. Constitution the most bloody and heaven-daring arrangement ever made by men. He called it an unblushing and monstrous coalition to do evil that good might come. In 1838, he established a non-resistance society which proclaimed, "We cannot acknowledge allegiance to any human government." In 1845, he said the United States was conceived in sin and brought forth in iniquity. You always knew where you stood with Garrison. And of course, in his most famous formulation, he called the Constitution a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. By the way, several of those locutions are not of his coinage. He got those from the Old and New Testament. Clearly, Garrison was not a constitutionalist. Beholden only to his conscience, he gave short shrift to the consent of the governed that makes government legitimate, and in America's case brought the Union, the United States, into existence. This was a non-starter for Lincoln, as it championed one principle of the Declaration of Independence, equality, while giving short shrift to that other principle of the Declaration, consent. Lincoln's nemesis, Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas, proposed an alternative to the immediatist abolition folks. His doctrine of popular sovereignty made consent the prime directive and eclipsed liberty as the summum bonum of American politics. It applied to what became the Kansas and Nebraska territories in 1854 and would simply let the people decide, white people of course, on the question of slavery in those territories. Congressional non-interference would be the rule, allowing only the settlers of the territories to decide the fate of slavery there. What could be more American than letting the people decide? But where Garrison sought equality at the expense of government by the consent of the governed, Douglas enshrined majority rule at the expense of human equality. Douglas's professed indifference regarding the future of slavery in the federal territories, a position Lincoln referred to as the don't care policy, because it taught Americans not to care about slavery as long as it was black slavery. This would actually result in the spread of slavery and its eventual legality in all of the American states. And this is what Lincoln said about that in 1857 in a speech regarding Chief Justice Taney's opinion in the Dred Scott case. This declared indifference, but as I must think, covert, real zeal for the spread of slavery, I cannot but hate. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites, causes the real friends of freedom to doubt our sincerity, and especially because it forces so many really good men amongst ourselves into an open war with the very fundamental principles of civil liberty, criticizing the Declaration of Independence and insisting that there is no right principle of action but self-interest. Applying popular sovereignty to slavery taught Americans that as long as folks voted on the issue, majority rule, mere majority rule, could determine whether slavery was right or wrong. Lincoln wanted both human equality and government by consent of the governed. He believed justice required both, and so was devoted to the principles of the Declaration, as well as the practice of self-government as manifested in the Constitution and the rule of law. Replying to a committee of German Republicans, Lincoln wrote, "Ever true to liberty, the Union, and the Constitution. True to liberty, not selfishly, but upon principle, not for special classes of men, but for all men. True to the Union and the Constitution, as the best means to advance liberty." He exhorted the group to be true to three things: liberty, union, and the Constitution. First on the list was liberty. He explained that the way to be true to liberty is to do so not selfishly, but upon principle, which means universally, namely, not for special classes of men, but for all men. This was his restatement of the equality principle of the Declaration of Independence, what he once called that immortal emblem of humanity. Turning to the Union and the Constitution, Lincoln said that true devotion to these things is intimately tied to liberty, for they are the best means to advance that liberty. For Lincoln, in other words, one demonstrates his commitment to liberty by upholding the American Union and federal Constitution as the best practicable means of promoting liberty. Because the liberties each person possesses by nature are not self-enforcing, the mechanism by which these liberties were to be protected becomes especially important. In other words, to speak of liberty as a priority without also explaining how one believed liberty ought to be secured in practice was to engage in mere moral grandstanding. At a Republican banquet in Chicago after the fall election of 1856, a reporter noted the connection Lincoln made between liberty as an end and union as its means. Here he says of Lincoln, "He maintained that the liberty for which we contended could best be obtained by a firm, a steady adherence to the Union. As Webster said, not union without liberty, not liberty without union, but union and liberty, now and forever, one and inseparable." Note the extremes Webster, and therewith Lincoln, seeks to avoid. Union without liberty is a union of American states indifferent to the spread of black slavery, while liberty without union is a call to free American slaves without concern for the rule of law and the Constitution, the principal political mechanisms that secure liberty in a civil society. Lincoln makes clear that union and liberty in America needed to be one and inseparable in order for self-government to survive. Alexander Hamilton Stevens, Alexander Stevens once denigrated Lincoln's devotion to union. He said, "I do not think he, Lincoln, intended to overthrow the institutions of the country. I do not think he understood them or the tendencies of his acts upon them. The union with him in sentiment rose to the sublimity of a religious mysticism, while his ideas of its structure and formation in logic rested upon nothing but the subtleties of a sophism." Did Lincoln only have an emotional attachment to union, as Stevens suggests, with no principled understanding of what it was or how it operated, or did he in fact explain what he believed the American Union consisted of, how it operated, and what its ends were? Lincoln did not want citizens to favor just any union of the American states, but a particular kind of union, one he believed that was established by the American founders. But in the mid-19th century, it appeared to be losing its hold on the public mind. Lincoln's reverence for the American Union reflected his awareness of the fragility of American self-government. This, I believe, explains his willingness to support the Constitution despite its protections for slavery as it then existed, for the good it already achieved and was yet capable of achieving. The peace of the Union, vital to the rights of the American experiment, or that the American experiment in free government aimed to secure, this peace was something Lincoln never took for granted. In fact, as he pointed out at length in 1838, his Lyceum address, that was about the perpetuation of our political institutions. the public peace was no small matter to achieve. It was the product of the orderly processes of law and courts, and conducive of the justice that is the hallmark of self-government. But it also required the orderly processes of thought and public discourse. Lincoln believed the true enemy of American self-government was internal, not external, to the regime, namely a condition of political laxity, whereby the people were corrupted or could be corrupted by their own freedom, unmindful of the true ground of their rights, and unaware of the threat that loomed in the wake of a tolerance of mob activity, vigilante justice, that sought justice but subverted the law in the process. That threat was a towering genius who could exploit the instability and discord of a community in the pursuit of glory, either at the expense of emancipating slaves or enslaving free men. Now, much is made about Lincoln and his focus on preserving the Union as the aim of his presidential administration. Why not pursue something nobler, like emancipating slaves? Lincoln believed, as we talked about last night, that the executive department's primary responsibility was to enforce the laws. As he put it at his first inauguration, "I shall take care, as the Constitution itself expressly enjoins upon me, that the laws of the Union be faithfully executed in all the states." 8 months, or almost 8 months into the Civil War, in his first State of the Union address, Lincoln discussed the main objective of the war, at least as far as the federal government was concerned. He said, "In considering the policy to be adopted for suppressing the insurrection, I have been anxious and careful that the inevitable conflict for this purpose shall not degenerate into a violent and remorseless revolutionary struggle. I have, therefore, in every case thought it proper to keep the integrity of the Union prominent as the primary object of the contest on our part, leaving all questions which are not of vital military importance to the more deliberate action of the legislature." The following year, in a very famous letter now, responding to New York Tribune editor Horace Greeley, Lincoln described his purpose in a statement still debated to this day. "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." This is August 22nd, 1862. And as Allen spelled out so well in his book, Lincoln already had the Emancipation Proclamation in his pocket. But again, why is the Union so important to Lincoln that he would make emancipation a secondary priority in the war effort? For Lincoln, as mentioned earlier, not any union, but a union of a certain character was essential. One hears so much about Lincoln's devotion to the Union that one should not overlook what Union signified for Lincoln: a national, common devotion to certain principles of self-government that Lincoln believed, quote, "gave promise that in due time the weight would be lifted from the shoulders of all men," end quote. In preserving the American Union, Lincoln believed he was defending self-government, which was the key to securing individual liberty. As he put it in his Peoria address of 1854, "Let us readopt the Declaration of Independence, and with it, the practices and policy which harmonize with it. If we do this, we shall not only have saved the Union, but we shall have so saved it as to make and to keep it forever worthy of the saving." Lincoln believed that rejecting the universal principles of American self-government, especially the sentiment of liberty in the country, as he called it, this would lead people, quote, "to transform government, or this government, into a government of some other form," end quote. Notice that the transformation, according to Lincoln, takes place without a single amendment being passed. Only Only by restoring liberty as the end served by the Constitution would the American Union be worth saving. 2 years later, he would argue that we, quote, have an interest in the maintenance of the principles of the government, and without this interest, it is worth nothing. I think we have an ever-growing interest in maintaining the free institutions of our country. As the nation grew increasingly divided over the future of slavery, Lincoln repeatedly cited the Declaration of Independence to remind Americans of the goal to which their federal union and governmental structure should be devoted. To lose sight of the goal of liberty to all was to subvert American self-government. It would turn Republican government into a form of majority rule that allowed mere numerical might to determine which individuals would receive the protection of their rights. If this were to happen, Lincoln once remarked, he would, quote, prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy. This particular union, therefore, requires a particular constitution, namely one devoted to liberty. Lincoln believed this liberty to be the birthright of all men and women, the equal entitlement of every human being, regardless of race. For Lincoln, the Union, the Constitution, and the freedom of mankind were always inextricably linked. Again, the Constitution and the Union do not exist for their own sake, but for the sake of liberty. As the Declaration put it, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. One could say that the Constitution channels consent, the consent of the governed. And if it is a prudently designed Constitution, it directs consent toward more of natural rights and their protection and less of mere majority might. What Lincoln called the sheet anchor of American republicanism, the consent of the governed, found its political expression in the rule of law and the Constitution. In contrast with vigilante justice or mob rule, laws and courts operate to secure the public's pursuit of justice in an orderly, deliberative fashion. One word, reason. What many interpret as Lincoln's inaction toward slavery is simply Lincoln's profound awareness that any good he tried to achieve politically must derive from the powers of office vested in him by the American people, whom he called my rightful masters. He said this in his first inaugural address, I think intentionally, to teach people, if they're going to use the word master, who the real masters were. Lincoln explained this in his now famous letter to Albert Hodges. I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. And yet I have never understood that the presidency conferred upon me an unrestricted right to act officially upon this judgment and feeling. He could not exercise power or authority, in other words, that was not given to him first by the American people. Now, the constraint of consent sets the context for any progress in securing the rights of individuals in a free society. And the pursuit of justice would always be required for its legitimacy. True statesmanship in a self-governing society displays a clear grasp of this just and necessary connection between Republican means and ends. Simply put, political prudence in a government of the people, by the people, for the people, recognizes that to achieve justice, moral posturing is not enough. One has the duty to persuade one's fellow citizens, which involves an appeal both to their heart and their head. Persuasion, not platitudes, is the democratic order of the day. And Lincoln thought the best way to persuade people to pursue justice in the political arena was to show them how it was even in their best interest to do so. This meant he had to inform their opinions while he accommodated their prejudices. What form did this persuasion take for Lincoln? It took a constitutional form. Simply put, a constitutionalist is someone who understands the Constitution as a limiting delegation of power as well as an aspiring instrument of liberty. In fact, without the principled aspirations of the Constitution, there would be no limitations on government's authority. To focus on the Constitution as a limiting document, important as that is, without due attention to the Constitution as an aspiring document, is to forget that the Constitution is a means, not an end. That said, Lincoln thought, of course, that the Constitution deserved to be revered as the best means of securing civil and religious liberty. In his 1838 Lyceum address, Lincoln addressed the problem of the United States the problem that the United States faced as its Revolutionary War generation, its veterans, were passing from the earth, leaving no living memory to help perpetuate the grand American Republic. And Lincoln believed only a political religion, so one time he used that phrase, he believed that a political religion of reverence for the laws and the Constitution, only that could prevent mob rule. Lincoln proclaims, "Let reverence for the laws be breathed by every American mother to the lisping babe that prattles on her lap. Let it be taught in schools and seminaries and in colleges. Let it be written in primers, spelling books, and almanacs. Let it be preached from the pulpit, proclaimed in legislative halls, and enforced in courts of justice. And in short, let it become the political religion of the nation. Let the old and the young, the rich and the poor, the grave and the gay, of all sexes and tongues and colors and conditions, sacrifice unceasingly upon its altars." This political religion needed a political preacher, and guess who tried to fulfill that role? This early concern about lawlessness in a self-governing regime turns out to be quite prescient, as Lincoln will have to deal with the most extensive lawlessness in the nation's history almost a quarter century later, when he becomes president. In his first inaugural address, we see one of the proof texts for Lincoln's bona fides as a constitutionalist. After equating secession with anarchy, a lawless social condition, Lincoln defines its alternative. A majority held in restraint by constitutional checks and limitations, and always changing easily with deliberate changes of popular opinions and sentiments, is the only true sovereign of a free people. Whoever rejects it does of necessity fly to anarchy or to despotism. A month before the 1864 presidential election, Lincoln said of the citizenry, "Their will, constitutionally expressed, is the ultimate law for all." Lincoln's constitutionalism reminded citizens, at least he tried to remind them, that the Constitution and laws and courts should be used by the people to secure the rights of all and not just the self-interest of the majority. Americans, in short, should limit their political objectives to those consistent with the ideals of the regime. Lincoln located these in the Declaration of Independence, what he called the father of all moral principle in the American people. Contrary to Douglas's popular sovereignty, which turned majority rule into crude majoritarianism, Lincoln taught that the nation should resist the temptation to become tyrants. He exhorted them to use their freedom in the following way. "As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. He who would be no slave must consent to have no slave. Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it." What do I have, Alan? 1 minute? Okay, since Hadley's going to talk about apples of gold, we'll leave that part out, although it's brilliant.
Cruel necessity.
I close. close. Or as Lincoln would put it, I am loath to close. Why did Lincoln want to save a constitutional union that permitted the enslavement of men on the basis of race, and hence violated the original idea of the equality that informed its basis? He said, we had slavery among us. We could not get our Constitution unless we permitted them to remain in slavery. We could not secure the good we did secure if we grasped for more. And having by necessity submitted to as much, it does not destroy the principle that is the charter of our liberties. He added, if we cannot give freedom to every creature, let us do nothing that will impose slavery upon any other creature. He pointed out that this holds true only if the people rest in the conviction that slavery is in the course of ultimate extinction. With the don't care rhetoric of an incumbent U.S. Senator gaining credence, the American people began to think that they could continue to secure the good of self-government while maintaining slavery as an option. The security of self-government required, therefore, not only the right political institutions, but the right political convictions. This requires a certain understanding of the American regime, a devotion to the equal rights of humanity. Keep sight of this, and Americans will be able, in the words of Lincoln, to rise up to the height of a generation of men worthy of a free government. In Lincoln's devotion to both the cause of the Union and the liberties of the country, one finds a statesmanship of the highest order and an abiding invitation to rise to the challenge of American self-government. Lincoln's legacy is his repeated appeals to the better angels of our nature in his political rhetoric. He was concerned that the lesser angels of American politics and society, our democratic demons, if you will, would sabotage the nation's experiment in self-government. Abraham Lincoln loved union because of what it could accomplish on behalf of liberty. And when he saw it being corrupted for the sake of slavery or disrupted to that same end, he made it his political goal to defend the United States in words and deeds that stand as the greatest political legacy of any American president. Thank you.
Good morning, and I'd like to start by thanking Kahle and the organizers of this conference for the very kind invitation to join you in the celebration of Lincoln's birthday, his 200th birthday. And I thought I would begin by building a little bridge from Lucas's talk to my talk to sort of keep us all located, and also to situate our panel within the larger conference. Lucas, an important theme I take out of Lucas's talk is the theme of consent. The title of my paper is The Case Against False Dichotomies, Soldiers and Lincoln, Union and Liberty. So I want to say that I don't consent to false dichotomies that I think we sometimes hear bandied about Lincoln and about today. I don't consent to a false dichotomy that says one political view is right with Lincoln and another political view is wrong with Lincoln. I think if we can all agree that Thomas D. Lorenzo and the radical neo-Confederates don't stand for the right, then we can also agree that the Lincoln haters that call Lincoln a racist don't stand for the left. If we all agree on that, we will get along just fine. The other thing to say is, I'm a historian. I have a very different relationship to the past. I don't think the past exists to make us feel good about what we think today. I don't think it has any obligation to us at all. I think we have an obligation to it. I think we have an obligation to try and understand the past. And that's what I see as my task. I think Abraham Lincoln's thinking undergoes an important shift during the Civil War, from a sincere commitment to liberty for all someday, to an immediate commitment to emancipation now. I think that's a big change. And what I want to do today is walk through how I think that change happened, step by step, during the Civil War. So I give you the case against false dichotomies, soldiers and Lincoln, Union and liberty. And I start by saying that to ask which mattered more to Lincoln, liberty or Union, is really to pose a false dichotomy. dichotomy, and I think that's been pretty well established. I have no bright spark for coming up with that one. As Lincoln saw it, the Union had to be saved because its survival mattered to all humanity. Saving it could only be achieved by removing the cause of its dissolution, which was slavery. In short, the Union mattered for all and could only be saved through liberty, immediate and real, for all. Now, the link between Union and immediate emancipation was not fully visible to Lincoln when the war began. But the war made it obvious to him. The process by which it did so was shared by the men of the Union Army. That shared process, in turn, I think helps explain why soldiers loved Lincoln so much. So I want to talk today about how exactly the war tied Union and immediate emancipation together for Lincoln, and also how it bound soldiers so tightly to Lincoln, because I think those processes were very closely related. Union soldiers' first-hand observations of slavery and the experience of a war far more terrible than they had expected quickly convinced them that the only way to save the war and to end the Union, or to end the war and save the Union, sorry, that was a major slip. The only way to end the war and save the Union was to end slavery. Lincoln's own observations of slaves and freed people in the nation's capital, the influence of Northern free blacks, the changing attitudes of Union soldiers, and the profound and pervasive loss brought by a war more terrible than Lincoln had been prepared for, similarly convinced Lincoln that saving Union and ending slavery immediately, not in the abstract someday, couldn't be ranked in some kind of hierarchical order, one first, then the other, for the plain reason that they couldn't be separated, practically, ideologically, or morally. So a step-by-step look at how that happened is what I want to do. That Lincoln hated slavery is undeniable. As he put it, if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. He hated it for all sorts of reasons. He hated it because it violated his belief in the right of every human being to rise in the world. He hated it because it violated his economic principles. He hated it because he thought it made a mockery of the founders. He hated it because he thought it elevated self-interest into the only acceptable justification for individual behavior. But above all, he hated it for the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. Lincoln's attitudes towards race were much more complicated. On numerous occasions before the war, he insisted very frankly that I am not in favor of Negro citizenship, even though several states did recognize African Americans as citizens. His early support for ending slavery was always accompanied by the supposition that freed slaves would leave the country. Now, his support for that outcome was based as much on his presumption that white people were prejudiced and would never get along with black people as they were rooted in any kind of antipathy towards people who looked differently from him. A universal feeling, which he believed white prejudice to be, whether well or ill-founded, cannot be safely disregarded, he cautioned in 1858. And he made a similar point in 1862 when he told a delegation of black men who visited him in the White House that there is an unwillingness on the part of our people, harsh as it may be, for you free-colored people to remain with us. Whatever the source of these more complex attitudes about race, they meant that Lincoln saw whites and blacks as separate and unequal and bound to stay that way. For most, if not, but not all, of his life. We need to bear in mind, and this is key, that for white Northerners, including Lincoln, slavery and race were two very separate things. It was entirely possible to think blacks and whites were different, to think they weren't equal, and to hate the institution of slavery. And if we can't understand that, we're never going to understand Lincoln or many other white Northerners. But Lincoln's belief in difference between the races does not in any way invalidate his anti-slavery credentials. It did, however, prevent him from advocating immediate emancipation for much of his life, partly because he lacked a clear plan for what should come after slavery, what happens next. Now, if Lincoln's ideas about race were complicated, his ideas about the government of the United States were crystal clear. He genuinely loved the principles stated in the Declaration of Independence with a reverence that bordered on religious devotion. And he regarded the Constitution and the Union as the necessary safeguards for those principles. However much Lincoln, the private person, hated human bondage, as President of the United States, he took an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the U.S. Constitution, a document that in 1861 protected the property rights of slave owners. Now that same document, Lincoln believed, empowered the federal government to control slavery in the territories. That's why his official policy was to halt the expansion of slavery. That policy, that platform, on which he won election to the presidency in 1860, propelled the seceding states out of the Union, thus bestowing on Lincoln the duty of restoring the Union. So, the easy high school history answer to Union or Liberty is, of course, Lincoln's first priority was to preserve the Union. A, because as president, that was his job, and B, because of his own genuine devotion to the government established by the founders. But thinking for even a moment about why the Union mattered so much to Lincoln reveals exactly how shallow and incomplete that answer really is. Why did that Union mean so much to Lincoln? In his view, the survival of the Union was far more than a matter of political power. It had to do with much more than territorial sovereignty, and it mattered for not just Americans. It mattered for all humanity. In his first message to Congress, Lincoln affirmed that the war embraces more than the fate of these United States. It presents to the whole family of man the question whether a constitutional republic or a democracy, a government of the people by the same people, can or cannot succeed. The Union had to survive in order to prove that the Republican government established by the founders on principles of liberty and equality and administered through fair and free elections could survive. If the Union was destroyed, he believed, human beings everywhere would be forced to draw the grim conclusion that self-government based on the ideals enunciated in the Declaration of Independence could not work. Now that view that Lincoln articulated in the message was not unique to him. It was shared by many Northerners, and it was especially prevalent in the ranks of the Union Army, men who'd been kids in 1848, when a series of revolutions across Europe had failed. From the very beginning, soldiers like Indiana Private W.D. Wildman insisted the Union is not only the citadel of our liberty, but the depository of the hopes of the human race. Nearly 3 years later, in the very darkest days of the war with the Union, Corporal George Cadman continued to urge his wife to remember that if he was hurt or killed, it will not be only for my country and my children, but for liberty all over the world. For if liberty should be crushed here, what hope would there be for the cause of human progress anywhere else? Now, right from the very beginning, some Americans recognized that if the Union was supposed to stand for universal principles, that it couldn't be separated from the issue of slavery. Most such Americans were black. Just weeks after the fall of Fort Sumter, a black newspaper in New York admonished no adjustment of the nation's difficulty as possible until the claims of the black man are first met and satisfied. If you would restore the Union you so fondly cherish, make way for liberty, universal and complete. By the time those words made it into print, enslaved black Southerners had already begun making their way into Union Army camps. They knew full well that the fact of their bondage had brought the two halves of the nation to blows, and they further knew that their fate and the fate of the Union were intertwined. It didn't take long for much of the Union rank and file to draw that same conclusion. As a group of Wisconsin soldiers put it, I love it, these guys do not mince words, the fact that slavery is the sole undeniable cause of this infamous rebellion, that it is a war of, by, and for slavery is as plain as the noonday sun. For them, there was nothing complicated about the coming of the war. Confederates seceded from the Union in order to protect slavery from a president who opposed its extension. Like it or not, that made it a war about slavery. And the more they saw slavery with their own eyes, the more they became convinced. Between August and December 1861, first year of the war, a striking pattern took shape. Soldier after soldier began to insist that since slavery had caused the war, only the destruction of slavery could end the war. You have no idea of the changes that have taken place in the minds of the soldiers in the last 2 months. One Wisconsin soldier wrote to his neighbor's home in October of 1861. Seeing the South and slavery with their own eyes forced men who cared little about slavery before the war to face this sum of all evils and cause of the war. As a result, men of all parties seem unanimous in the belief that to permanently establish the Union is to first wipe out the institution of slavery. In short, the rebellion is abolitionizing the whole army. Interactions with the hundreds and then thousands of slaves who ran to Union Army camps, so-called contrabands, made many men in blue even more sure. Sometimes the plight of the contrabands simply touched the humanity within a hard-bitten soldier. A Michigan officer had always been very bitter on the abolitionists, but when 20 contrabands proved themselves willing to cross a dangerous river to get to freedom, he spent more than 3 hours in water up to his waist to help them get across, and when asked about his actions, he merely shrugged, "I had to help them." Frank necessity also changed soldiers' minds. They needed former slaves. Contrabands were willing to labor to keep camps running. Union troops didn't know the local terrain, black Southerners did. Blacks coming into Union lines also usually knew what the enemy was up to. Army records are full of officers' reports about close calls averted thanks to reports from what they called intelligent contrabands. Ordinary soldiers commented on that phenomenon frequently as well. A Wisconsin private noted that a company in his regiment was probably saved from destruction while on picket 2 weeks ago by a slave giving them notice that they were to be attacked. "Our only friends here are the slaves," the private concluded, and any decent soldier knew to look out for his friends. In some, throughout the rank and file, enlisted soldiers reasoned that only the elimination of the war's cause could end the rebellion and prevent it from happening all over again. Further, seeing the reality of slavery impressed upon them how much crueler it was than they had imagined, and their own reliance on the aid of local blacks taught them that their interests and the ultimate success of their cause were closely allied with the interests of the enslaved. For these reasons, many in the Union Army championed the destruction of slavery a full year ahead of the Emancipation Proclamation, well before most civilians or political leaders did. And they didn't do this just in the privacy of their own minds or in the camaraderie of camp. They wrote vociferous letters to families, to neighbors, to friends, to local newspapers, to their elected officials, to their president, arguing forcefully that if the Union wanted to win, it had no choice but to get rid of slavery. The obligatory caveats. First, the obvious one. At no point did everyone in the Union Army agree on anything except that they all wanted to go home. So anything as important as emancipation, of course there was disagreement. There's always a vocal minority, but it is a minority, of Union soldiers who opposed emancipation. Second, calling for emancipation is not at all the same thing as calling for racial equality. Race, slavery, still two different things. And third, Lincoln didn't move as fast as the men in the ranks did toward calling for immediate emancipation. A lot of reasons for that. He had a more complex array of duties than soldiers did, and chief among those duties in 1861 was keeping the border slave states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri in the Union. That mattered a whole lot. Look at a map. Rivers that go from Kentucky will either be lines of invasion into the south or into the north. Kentucky mattered a very great deal. He knew the surefire way to lose Kentucky was to threaten slavery. When Union Army commanders like John C. Fremont and David Hunter made bold moves against slavery, the president rescinded them. Lincoln also knew some civilians, northern civilians, bitterly opposed emancipation. Union soldiers could try to preach the reluctance out of the anti-emancipation stay-at-homes, but Lincoln needed the political support of everybody too badly to risk alienating a large swath of opinion. Beyond the political demands on him, Lincoln personally had to think emancipation through a little more carefully than soldiers calling for immediate action did. He was no less anxious for slavery to die in the abstract. One thing straight, I am not a Lincoln detractor. The pride of my life is that my son, before he turned 2, could identify Lincoln from any picture with or without beard. But how emancipation mattered. That mattered to Lincoln more than it did to soldiers, as did long-term questions about what should happen after slavery. Lincoln's reservations that meant that where Union soldiers urged action now, Lincoln maintained a look before you leap attitude. As late as 1862, he still harbored reservations about whether black and white could coexist peacefully, as he made quite clear when he summarily dismissed the delegation of black men who visited him that August. Lincoln was also a genuine devotee of legal process, with equal emphasis on legal and process. So initially, he favored ending slavery through some sort of gradual compensated program, and he'd really liked the states to have done it. The end result was that well into the second year of the war, Lincoln endeavored to keep the focus of the war on what was for him the less ambiguous question, the survival of the Union as the world's last best hope for self-government and for the triumph of principles like human equality. But Lincoln couldn't keep the questions of Union and emancipation separate indefinitely. The utter conviction that slavery was wrong was a genuine constant in his life. even when it did seem to get buried sometimes by other wartime problems. Events in 1862 helped to bring that ingrained conviction closer to the surface. The war didn't go as planned. He had to consider new alternatives. Moreover, 3 groups of people saw to it that even if he had wanted to duck the slavery question, he couldn't have. One such group was Northern abolitionists, black and white, who comprised a teeny tiny minority of the Northern population, so you shouldn't overestimate their influence, but they kept the pressure on the slavery question high. Another group was slaves themselves, who saw through, ignored, or were otherwise undeterred by official pronouncements about a war for Union, but not for slavery. Thousands of them kept running to Union camps, kept making themselves indispensable, and kept the slavery question squarely in the face of officers, who in turn kept writing to Washington for guidance on what to do about slaves and slavery. Even if all Lincoln wanted to do was read plain, unadorned war news on the telegraph wires that he checked as obsessively as we check our email, he couldn't have escaped the slavery question because slaves wouldn't let him. Generals in the field were constantly telegraphing, informing the president that they had acted on news from an intelligent contraband, or asking how to handle clashes between local civilians and runaway slaves. By the summer of 1862, the contraband phenomenon had literally hit home for Lincoln. He spent much of that summer with his family in a cottage on the grounds of the Soldiers' Home on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., and he commuted into the White House every day. One of the routes that he commonly took went right past a contraband camp that grew exponentially over the course of the war. His family's cook at the cottage, Mary Dines, had herself gone through that contraband camp. Elizabeth Kahle, his wife, the dressmaker and confidant to Mary Lincoln, worked for the Contraband Relief Association in Washington, and at her urging, Mrs. Lincoln lobbied the president to channel war relief funds to buy blankets and other things for contrabands in Washington. Simply put, contrabands gave little choice to Lincoln, but to take them seriously and to begin to treat slavery less as an abstraction, one he really cared about, but an abstraction, and more as a concrete reality that needed addressing right now. The third group was Union soldiers. By 1862, the average soldier in blue was genuinely fond of the president. As a Connecticut soldier put it, Lincoln's popularity in the Army is and has been universal. But that fondness did not prevent impatience with the pokey federal government for failing to grasp what to soldiers was the plain fact that winning the war meant ending slavery now. Frustrated with Lincoln's caution, a Wisconsin soldier spat, "Great God, what a system!" And still, our government handles slavery as tenderly as a mother would her firstborn. When shall it be stricken down as the deadly enemy of freedom, virtue, and mankind? Now, Lincoln called soldiers thinking bayonets, and he had genuine respect for their opinions. He often stopped to speak to the enlisted men who guarded him, and that got him into the habit of taking soldiers' ideas seriously. He brought that habit with him when he went to visit troops in the field. One such visit took place in June 1862, when Lincoln went to see General George McClellan's Army of the Potomac. We remember that visit partly for the Harrison's Landing letter, in which McClellan warned Lincoln that a declaration of radical views on the slavery question would rapidly disband the Army. Now, had Lincoln not gone to visit the troops himself, he might have taken McClellan's letter at face value. Historians certainly have. I did for a very long time. But McClellan consistently overestimated the odds against any plan that he opposed. How many Confederates are in Centerville? 170,000, and there's 20,000. That's McClellan. He opposed emancipation, and that's what he's doing in the Harrison Landing.